I'm the Reverend Rosemary Bray McNatt. It is my honor to serve as president of Star King School of Ministry. And this is the annual Star King's President's Lecture. And this year we thought we'd do something a little different. Instead of having a single person up here giving a lecture, we would have a conversation among a multi-generational panel around the question why, or not even the question, the statement, why we still can't wait. I want to say that I am one of those people who came to Unitarian Universalism via marriage. And I knew very little about the Black empowerment issues that occurred in this movement. At first, I was just in love with Unitarian Universalism as I experienced it at Community Church of New York, which is a long time hub of Unitarian Universalist social action. And that was the congregation that I fell in love with. But I found that in the intervening years, as I learned more about the history of our movement in relation to race, that you could start quite a heated discussion at a coffee hour at Community Church. If you mention acronyms like BAC or BUCK or BAWA. And so I had to learn all these different groups and where they stood and try to figure out where Community Church had been in the moment or the years of the controversy surrounding what some people call the walkout and what some people call the exodus. And we are now at the 50th anniversary mark of that event. So it's important to us at Star King, who has a decades-long history of work to dismantle white supremacy and educating to counter oppression is the foundation of all that we do at Star King. We thought it was really important to lift up some of the people and the events and some of the questions that are raised in light of this anniversary, particularly because we are now engaged in conversation about a proposed eighth principle that is explicit in its desire to dismantle white supremacy culture. So what you're going to hear from, who you're going to hear from today are three people who have been thinking about this, sometimes with me, sometimes alone. Mtangulizi Sanyika, or Baba Sanyika as we call him, will be first. He was present and active in Cleveland in 1969. And he has a lot to say about framing this conversation and giving us some historical background about it, things that not a lot of people talk about or know. Next, we have Kim Hampton from St. Louis, a friend of Star King, School for the Ministry, and a person who writes and thinks a lot about these issues, particularly on her blog. And the Reverend Sam Teitel, who is minister of Church of the River in Memphis, Tennessee, a church that has had a complicated and difficult history around race. The fact that he is my godson is completely immaterial. Nonetheless, I am proud. So we're going to start with Baba.
First of all, let me give all honor and praises to the ancestors and to the Most High. Out of due respect that yesterday, June 19th, was Juneteenth.
Yes,
sir. So we need to recognize the space that we are in. It's no accident that I traveled on Juneteenth thinking about the ancestors and got here today, the day after Juneteenth, but Juneteenth is still running through my spirit on this day, remembering the experience of African descended people who were enslaved and learned later that the Emancipation Proclamation had been signed, because in Texas, where I happen to live now because of Katrina, black folks didn't know they were free. So I just want to point that out, and I want to also give praises and appreciation to Rosemary, the distinguished president of Star King. I'm glad they made the right decision to do that. I had the privilege of teaching there under the tutelage of her predecessor, and wish I could come back and teach again one day. But that's a plug. But I want to thank her for this. I want to thank her for providing this opportunity to have a conversation about something that happened historically this year, the 50th year. Let me share with you that I was the chairperson of the group called BUCK, the Black Unitarian Universalist Caucus, that was formed in October of 1967 in New York with a denomination called the Conference, the Emergency Conference on the Unitarian Universalist Response to the Black Rebellion. And when the black persons at that conference responded by forming a caucus, it caused an enormous disturbance in the psyche, the soul, the being of those persons who were there who called themselves Unitarian Universalists, because we were attacked and accused of being separatists, because we had a caucus and we didn't let any white folks in the caucus. That was the problem. Not that there was a caucus, the problem was white folks weren't in it. But what was happening all over America was a sea change had taken place that Unitarian Universalists hadn't caught up with. Unitarian Universalists were still living in a dream world. It's like, you remember the story of Rip Van Winkle, who had gone to sleep and woke up and said, well, what happened, y'all? That's the same thing that happened to Unitarian Universalists. They went to sleep because they thought the experience of Washington in 1963 and then Selma in 1965 accorded upon them an exception to the norm that was happening in the rest of society. You see, the entirety of the church, the white church in America, was experiencing a black revolution, but Unitarian Universalists thought that they would not experience that same revolution. So when they convened all of these black folks, 37 of us, who had never seen, heard, or known each other in history, in one place at the same time, it was like a miracle had happened. Like, wow, who are you? Because we had never been brought together or seen or knew each other, and decided 30 of the 37 were going to caucus and said, we want to caucus alone, by ourselves. And we think that you need to honor and respect that. And the demand that we came out was the funding of a Black Affairs Council for $250,000 a year for the next 4 years, and that would be controlled by the black constituents of the church. That was a revolutionary act on our part, and it disturbed the white structure of Unitarianism because it meant a radical shift in how the racial justice agenda was being defined, which heretofore had been defined by white males, a small number of white males, and whomever the Negroes were that they could bring along with them. Excuse me, I'm not being pejorative, but I am. And so when we said that the racial justice agenda should be controlled by black people because of self-determination, remember what happened in 1966 when Stokely Carmichael, also known as Kwame Ture, articulated the Black Power Mugabe statement in Mississippi along with Willie Ricks. It revolutionized the way we looked at race in America. Heretofore, we had assumed that assimilation and integration was the appropriate paradigm. That meant, however, that black folks were joining white folks. It meant that black folks had no isness and no be-ness and no who-ness, and that what we had to do was associate and affiliate with white people in order to be human. Black Power said the opposite. It said, we can be a self-determining people. We come from a great tradition. The beginning of the human race began on the African continent, and we are the descendants of that that set of human beings, as is everybody else. That didn't mean we were saying we were better than or superior to, or any of that they wanted to associate with us. But we said, no, that's not what we're saying. What we're saying is we want to define the racial justice agenda, build institutions in our community in a self-determining way, and the Liberation Project is no longer this notion that social justice will be a derivative of association and assimilation into white norms. So that was what caused the revolution in Unitarianism because Unitarian Universalists wanted to believe so dearly that they were God's gift to racial justice. They wanted to believe that they were the exception to all the rules about racism. We have no racism in this church, though there are no black preachers in the congregation, no black people in religious education, no black people on committees, but we have no racism in this church, you understand. We are the exception because we got 7 principles that say we are. The first of which talks about the dignity and worth of human value, except my value doesn't count. That was the problem. And we became the existential threat to the 7 principles, all 7 of them. We had an 8th principle, and it was justice and liberation led by black people for black people. It made sense to us, but it didn't make sense to anybody else. Well, 1968 in Cleveland, they funded the Black Affairs $1 million for 4 years. That is what was said. Come 1969, however, we have all of this movement the opposite direction. It was an election year, if you remember. That's the year that Bob West won the election, who succeeded Dana Greeley, who left an association in a $1.6 billion deficit. And that General Assembly, instead of just reaffirming the funding of the Black Affairs Council, began a parliamentary process that wanted to put the funding issue at the end of the agenda and also give money to our opponents called Bawat. We said, hell no, we won't go. Either you decide to fund us and not them, or we will not seek the funding and receive the funding at all. Well, there was a lot of argument back and forth about that. So what happened is I led a movement at that point to seize the microphones at the General Assembly and stop the General Assembly, period. We simply said, us and LRY, all the young people with us, and Fullback, which is a white support group, all seized the microphone, shut the assembly down. Well, after we shut the assembly down twice, they still didn't get the message, kept the voting process and the parliamentary maneuvering going, and eventually we decided we had had enough, and we said goodbye. Kwaheri Yakuanana. We got up and walked out, we split. We left the General Assembly, and an entire host of our white colleagues left the General Assembly with us. They called it a walkout, but for us it was an exodus because it was the beginning of the end, because there was a violation of the covenant relationship that we thought had been established between the people through the General Assembly and ourselves. It was a violation of the prophetic legacy of the Unitarian tradition of justice for them to have reneged and to put our issue at the bottom of the agenda and then subsequently to manipulate it, reduce the funding, spread it out over a 5-year period. We walked out, but we left the church behind us. That's the difference between a walkout and an exodus. And we said, look, we're sorry that you've done what you've done, but the only reason we can justify staying here right now is that you are funding social justice led by black people. If you can't do that, we find no reason to stay in the denomination at all, because there was no relevance to just be with white people, to be with white people, to be with white people. Now, there are some people who like to do that, but a whole lot of us didn't. The issue wasn't just being with white folks, but being with white folks. The issue was justice and liberation. And the people in Fullback, who were our white supporters, were people who we got along with exceptionally well. But there were those who were conservative liberals. You see, theological liberalism is not necessarily symmetrical with social and political liberalism. We discovered that there was progressive liberalism, moderate liberalism, and conservative liberalism, all inside the Unitarian Universalist formation. So when we left, we took 1,500 people with us eventually who left the Unitarian Universalist denomination. Well, but we left a legacy behind in the process. Number one, we shifted the racial justice agenda from white dominated and white control to African Americans and other people of color opening the door. Number two, there were more black people who were subsequently appointed to positions than had ever been appointed before after the exodus happened. Number three, we left the legacy of black humanism, which opened the conversation about humanism in a very, very different way than it had ever been previously discussed before. Number four, we compel white Unitarian Universalists to look at themselves in a way that they had never been able to do before. In other words, we unmasked the facade that all was well in their soul because we discovered that they were disturbed. They didn't know how to articulate that disturbance, but black power compelled all white America to say the truth of the matter, which is that white privilege has corrupted all of us. Not just white people, but black people Unitarians, no exception to that rule. And the first act to liberate self is to acknowledge and admit the contradiction. So what did the Black Power movement do then? It helped Unitarian Universalists to look at the contradiction by looking at themselves. I'm trying to write and finish a book about all of this, and I have some of the works on the table, some documents from 50 years ago that I'd be glad to talk to you about. But we also did the Congress of African People. We helped to do Black Side, which developed the Eyes on the Prize. We helped to do Kwanzaa to make it a national holiday among African Americans. We did in the Congress of African People set the tone for the Gary Convention, which set the tone for the Jesse Jackson election campaign, which set the tone for the election of Barack Obama. So you had something to do with that indirectly without even knowing that you had done that. That's a piece of what we have done. So I don't have time to go into all of the details, but let's just say the summary is that the 1969 conference, 59 years ago, GA, experienced something that it had never experienced before, which was that people were willing to put their lives on the line to say no to further injustice being disguised as parliamentary maneuvering. And we said, if we cannot have justice in this house, there's no longer any need for us to be in this house. And so we exited with an exodus that put the pain exactly where the pain should have been belonged, and that is into the eyes of the perpetrators, so that they see without an eighth principle, without diversity and commitment to dismantle white supremacy and racism, there is no religious basis to be in a relationship with anybody at all. But there's always hope and promise if the Liberation Project can penetrate everybody's soul and spirit and their hearts and minds so that they too can be actors in the Liberation Project.
The poet Lucille Clifton wrote a piece called Why Some People Be Mad at Me Sometimes. And it says, they asked me to remember, but they want me to remember their memories. And I keep remembering mine. I'm a historian by avocation, and so I spend a good deal of my days reading other people's mess. And so, since I've been around Unitarian Universalists for more than a minute, I've read a whole bunch of our mess. And the one thing I always come away with is denial truly is not a river in Africa.
Amen.
We have been in denial about race since 1860. And the reason I bring up 1860 is the Reverend William Jackson walked into the autumnal meeting of the then still nascent baby American Unitarian Association meeting in New Bedford, Massachusetts. Now, I spent a year in Massachusetts doing my internship in Worcester, and so, I'm kind of used to New England sensibilities now. And so I could imagine how Reverend Jackson felt when he walked into that autumnal meeting and got treated as if he were ancillary. Because what happened at that autumnal meeting is the Reverend William Jackson declared that he was a Unitarian. Glory be. And that he was going to bring his congregation at that time, which was the Calvary Baptist Church, into the Unitarian fold. Nice. Which is essentially what they said. They took up a small collection, which at that time was, I think it was $110 or so. In today's money, it'd be about $1,000. They gave it to Reverend Jackson and sent him on his way. As far as we can tell, Calvary actually never became Calvary Unitarian Church. I wish it had, that would make me so happy. And for another 40 years, nothing on the Unitarian side. On the Universalist side, there were the Joseph Jordans in Virginia, who set up a school, a training center, and a church. They came to one of our august gatherings and asked for money to start a seminary. They asked for $5,000. And for those of you who know anything about what Unitarians and Universalists were doing at around the turn of the century, they were starting misadventures in Japan. And at that time, they were spending about $10,000 a year on misadventures in Japan. The Joseph Jordans were asking for $5,000 total. They got $1,000. No seminary. So we have a whole another few years. Ethelred Brown comes up, has to, in all his wrangling, has to threaten to sue the AUA to get his fellowship back. Louis McGee was essentially called a good nigger because he was educated, AME and all that. Only was a senior pastor once. And so we have this long history of relegating people of color to the side and then wondering why we don't grow. Denial is not just a river in Africa. Why we cannot wait, I was the one that came up with the title, by the way, is because we've been waiting since 1860. And this is how far we've come. I don't know about the rest of you, but I don't have time anymore. Babies are dying. There are babies in cages. Black women are dying 4 times the rate of white women when they give birth. I don't have time anymore. And so we cannot wait because the circumstances cannot wait. We're either in the fight or we're not.
Hi, my name is Reverend Sam Teitel, and I serve as the minister of First Unitarian Church in Memphis, Tennessee, that are known as the Church of the River, and I'm so honored and humbled to be asked to talk to you all this afternoon. Rosemary asked me to get up and talk about some work that my congregation has been doing to try and face and process some of our own history and a 50-year anniversary that we just encountered. April 2018 marked the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., which happened in Memphis about 1.5 miles from our church. And so last year we were getting closer to this anniversary and trying to figure out, what would our role be as a congregation in observing that anniversary. During the 1960s, my congregation did not, as a whole, have much to do with the civil rights movement, by which I mean 2 ministers were fired by congregational vote for opposing segregation.
Wow.
And the minister who came after them, James Madison Barr, wrote and published extensively about his belief in preserving the institution of segregation and preached sermons that were openly hostile towards Dr. King and the civil rights movement before and after the assassination. In 1968, after this horrible act of white supremacist violence in our city, many churches and clergy people mobilized and marched and acted and advocated. There's a picture in the Civil Rights Museum of Memphis clergy confronting Mayor Henry Loeb of Memphis. Memphis' segregationist mayor, and it's taken from over Mayor Loeb's shoulder. So you can see the clergy looking at him, and you can see the shotgun under his desk. But the Unitarian Universalists in Memphis were not only intentionally absent, but were actively contributing to these systems that oppressed and killed people. And as far as I can tell, in the intervening decades, this isn't really a thing that got talked about at the Church of the River a whole lot. And so then I got called last year, and it's my first year, the first thing that we looked at was this 50th anniversary, and faced with this question, what do we do in the face of this thing that happened 50 years ago when we didn't get it right then, and we're not really getting it right now? And how do we handle that legacy? What I was interested in, how do we handle this in a way that is a specifically Unitarian Universalist way to deal with it? Right, because when harm has been caused, and how does the community respond? That's one of the questions that religion is supposed to answer, right? There's Catholic and Jewish and Buddhist mechanisms and teaching on what to do about this. And UUs don't have a lot, right? The 7 principles are this beautiful goal to reach for, but they don't really address where we are or how to get where we would like to be. And so what ended up working for us was the values presented in this 8th principle. What ended up working for us was this principle that acknowledges the oppression and white supremacy that are present in us and in our institutions, and instructs us to name and work towards dismantling those forces. And so that's what we've started to do. We've had some frank conversations. I've preached some sermons that have made some people very angry. We had a special worship service about this on the MLK 50 event the night before. And we're still doing the work. We're doing it slowly and messily and not as well as we could be, but that's much better than not doing it. And it's messy and hard, but it feels like the Unitarian Universalist things to do. And as we UU start to encounter the painful parts of our history, the 8th principle is going to be crucial, and also the 9th principle, right? And also the 10th, right? Because it took us 7 principles to say good things are good. And it will take 7 more at least to say bad things are bad.
Okay.
And then however many more after that to say, so what now? But that, I believe, is the work that is ahead of us. And that, I believe, is where the future of Unitarian Universalism and confronting our own history and our own present is.
We're going to make sure that there's time for questions. But I want to say that as the leader of an institution that has spent the last 30 years working on dismantling white supremacy culture, that there is so much pain to be uncovered, so much wrong to be set right. And part of what we try to do at Star King is to give our students tools to do this work. A mind and a capacity to understand how deep the work is, how much it intersects with other kinds of oppressions, that they all reinforce one another. We hope to teach them to be unafraid to face this work and to be fearless in approaching it. It's not easy, and our students struggle, but all of us do in one point or another. We struggle. Some things feel harder than other things, but the only way out is through. That is the thing that we talk about with people all the time, in every class, in all of our work. And it's become clear to us at the school, and one of the motivations for this panel, to help Unitarian Universalists understand the work. We believe that we have the capacity to be a resource for our faith because of the struggles that we have gone through and the victories that we have won in shaping a conversation that is long overdue. And so I want to invite you to ask whatever questions you might want to ask, whether of me or of our panel members. And I'm really glad to see so many of you here to talk about this important milestone and the important work we still have to do.
I have a question that's kind of come up for me and some other folks that I've talked to since there's been an increasing bringing of ancestors into the UU worship spaces. And my ancestors, what I know of them, isn't that inspirational or that or something that I necessarily know what to do with. And so I always find myself feeling a little like, okay, what do I do with this? You know, when that comes up, because I recognize the importance of it and that there are ancestors I can take positive, things from. But there's a lot, I have an ancestor who went out of his way to leave West Virginia to go over to Virginia and enlist in the Confederate Army. And that's just the truth of it, And so what would you say to folks like me who have that kind of, that's what ancestors provokes for us. What to do with that and how to work through that. And for me, it's related to this whole conversation. Because we got to do the individual work to do the collective work, And so this is one that's just been coming up for me a lot recently. So I'd love to hear what you have to say, or anyone else. But
Well, I'll start and say that I think that is spiritual work. Because you can't change that part of your past. And I don't know anybody who doesn't have an ancestor or a family member who lives or did live counter to values that we hold.
Thank you.
I don't know anybody of any race, of any gender, who doesn't have the work of oppression real for them. And I think it's spiritual work because the tendency is always to want to blame ourselves as though we had some responsibility for it. When the people we are responsible for are ourselves. But it's spiritual work to come to terms with and to accept what is negative or difficult in our own lives. And that's whether we have an ancestor or a sibling or whoever else it is in our lives. I don't think anybody can move forward in doing the work of liberation, looking over their shoulder about things they can't do anything about. Sometimes we find that there are ways to make amends. Sometimes the connection is so direct that there is a specific thing that might be done. But barring that, I think this is a matter of acceptance and the capacity to work with that knowledge to move toward a liberatory place. Is there anyone else who wants to?
Yeah.
Yeah.
First of all, let me say thank you for your question because it is to be recognized that different cultures have had different histories with their ancestors. We of African descent in the liberation movement pay particular attention to our ancestors. We venerate them. We don't worship them, however. And everybody venerates their ancestors. That's why you have museums. But when you put white folks' pictures on the wall, or on coins, or on bills, it's not called veneration. It's just called what you do. But when other cultures lift up their ancestors, people sometimes wonder, why are you talking about your ancestors all the time? For those of us who have gone through the struggle against racism, ancestry relationships are critically important because that's how we got over it. See, somebody prayed for me. I didn't just get where I got by myself. And I've got to stop and give thanks to the Most High, first of all, and to the ancestors who prayed for me, who saved their little nickels and their little dimes, and who told me, boy, this is what you got to do to try to be somebody. I love you and I care for you. That is critical. If you think you can have a future, you must be able to accept parts of your past that were related to the liberatory side and the parts of the past that may not have been as positive to the liberatory side. But the other ancestral veneration we do is all the way back to the African continent, because that's where Homo sapiens began. That's what scientists tell us. And even for the creationists, it's in Genesis 2, 5, and 10 that it came through the River Nile and through the Gihon and the Pihon. So I'm not being a supremacist. I'm just saying what history says and what the facts are, that all humanity began on the African continent. That's our ancestor. So we are reconnecting with the past that we have been denied and that has been taken from us, because we have been told we have no history, that our history began with slavery, you see? So that's another reason we go back to ancestors, which is not to deny the experience of any other ancestors. And we have an Uncle Joe we don't like to talk about too.
Come on.
But that's why we do ancestral acknowledgement, and we think it's important in the Liberation Project to be able to acknowledge ancestors in that way.
We have another question.
I just wanted to follow up with that and to mention that in the languaging, the acknowledgement of the ancestors, personally, I name, whether I say the actual name, I name their deeds. So I'm honoring those whose shoulders I stand on. I'm honoring those who worked from sun up to sundown. I am honoring those who paved the way for me. You see what I'm doing? I'm claiming and acknowledging those that in fact stood out, made the sacrifices, etc. Like the Uncle Joe that he didn't do that, he didn't get claimed up in there. So.
Sophia, comment.
I'm Sophia Benakota. I have the privilege of serving on the striking faculty, and I want to say that we actually teach a class in ancestral healing and repair. A member of our faculty, Teitel, who is a white Jewish woman, does spiritual practices, not just in Jewish practice, that are about what it means to do healing along the ancestral line. And I cannot lift all of her teachings for you, but one is an intensive. You could come and be a special student and actually take this class with us. And part of what I find really powerful about the way she talks about these teachings is she says there is always health in our ancestral line, and that the ancestors behind us who are still in need of healing and repair can benefit from us working with those who are ready to do the work. And there are spiritual practices that ground us in ancestral healing. And the reason why we do that, have you seen that meme that says if we have intergenerational trauma, we also have transgenerational wisdom? Mm-hmm. We gotta pull it all forward. Come study it,
Amen. All right.
Yes.
We need a mic.
I'm trying to go back and forth, folks.
So are there congregations that have adopted the eighth principle at the congregational
Yes.
level? And if so, how did they go about doing that? Who are they?
Yes.
I don't know them all. We know some.
I can't give exact numbers, but there are a couple dozen, I think it's about now. Most of them do it through regular UU practice of congregational vote, which is, the way things are done. For some congregations, it has been easier to get to that vote because they were already doing work, and a whole bunch of them had Paula come in and talk about it. Because she's a fabulous resource. If you don't know Paula Colzone, you should know Paula Colzone.
Go to the workshop.
And go to the workshop at 4:30.
This side.
Thank you. I'd like to shift gears a little bit. I want to go back in time, and I am really interested in knowing what the panel thinks about and what the relationship was with those African Americans who stayed in the UU denomination during that time that you're talking about, the revolution, the walkout, whatever you want to say, Bawa. What was there a relationship that was built over time with those people who stayed, and what was the thinking about?
Yes.
Okay, so first I want to, the only part of Unitarian Universalism I ever knew were about the Black people who stayed. And community church was a hotbed of Bawa and sort of clandestine back members.
What are the acronyms?
I'm sorry, you're right. Black and White
Action.
Action, that was Bawa. Buck was Black Unitarian Caucus, and
Back is Black Affairs Council.
back was Black Affairs Council. So the back and the Bawa people were at community church. And community church was so integrated, and remember that that was a value at the time. There were so many Black people at community church when I joined it, that going to my first GA was the culture shock of my life. I had no idea there were that many white Unitarians. So depending on what congregation you were in, all what you knew about this argument had to do with what church you were in.
Thank you very much for that question, because it remains to be one of the sensitive issues in the history right now, because there are those who would claim, first of all, that there were not 1,500 Black Unitarian Universalists at that time, and there are those who would claim that many didn't actually exit and leave. They can continue with their claims, but we will still make the historical argument because of the data we collected. And we believe our own history, not the history that others are using to suit their paradigm. That's their business. We left. So we didn't really care about who stayed and why they stayed. However, we know people who did stay, and we had with those people even after we left. Some of us were friends. And some of the people who stayed, I think you have to go back into the question of why Black people were in the Unitarian Universalist Church in the first place. And that's part of what I'm writing about too. And there are differing reasons people were in. And so there are different reasons people left and different reasons for people stayed. And they were not all a monolith at all. And I have learned over time not to condemn those who stayed. I didn't always, believe me, I've not always been there. I've been rather on a very strict side, that I've gotten older and slow down a little bit and understand people's behavior. One of my beloved friends is Norma Poinsett, the wife of Alex Poinsett, who wrote this article called It's Nation Time about the Black Affairs Council in Buck. That was published in an article. That was her spouse. He left and she stayed. And she still stayed, but he came back after about 20 years of having left. I cite Norma and Alex because there were other examples of people who we maintained a relationship with and said to them, you have to determine and define why you were in that white institution. We're telling you the reason we left is because we had an existential crisis. The institution was unable to address the issues of Black liberation. That's why we left. Now, personally, you may have had a spouse. You may have really believed that these white folks were going to save you. You may have been committed to the notion of interracial assimilation, or they may have been involved in social action that you wanted to relate to, all of which has their merit, except on the question of Black liberation, the institution failed. Thus, there was no justification for staying in the institution, because in the 60s, if you were in a white institution, you had to explain it to Black people, or you were regarded as not a cop-out or a sellout, but almost a traitor at that time. And so you had to justify the relationship you had with white folks and why you were in that institution. And the litmus test was, what is the relationship of the institution to the Black Liberation Project? I contend that is still the question. Now, there's a theological dimension to that that has always been there for me. I'm a Black humanist. I learned some of my humanism inside of Unitarian Universalism, but I learned even more from Kimberly science, and from the Husia, and from the Order Democratic, and the tradition of the African American church, and Akan humanism. But I learned some too inside of UUism, so there was some value that I got out of that experience at a time when the Christian church wouldn't let me think the way I wanted to think. So I appreciate that. I don't condemn it all. But I am saying that there were people who stayed for their own personal reasons. But the liberation movement had passed Unitarian Universalism by. It had just swept right on by into a whole new place. And that was the litmus test at that time in history for why you stay or not, for those of us who left. And so we still laugh sometimes with those who stayed about why they stayed, because the liberation movement has not succeeded. And Unitarian Universalism still seems stuck somewhere about the question of Black liberation and about white supremacy. I'm not sure how much progress it has made. So if you stay, if you stay, you have to have an explanation for yourself between you and your Most High about why you have done that.
As a member of the white supremacy, however reluctantly, wanting to change things, what is the most important first step we should take? I mean, I know all of it, but it's a lot to tackle.
I think the first step is to acknowledge the contradiction within the self.
Yeah, you need that mic for that.
Yeah, you asked the question. I'm glad you asked the question, because it's a question that you will never answer in your lifetime. No, will any of us. For the time that we have on earth, we all committed to some form of liberation. Whatever it may be, it's okay with me. Whether it's liberation around identity issues, environmental issues, other social justice issues. If your life is committed to the fight against supremacy, that to me is the first step. Find some part of the supremacy superstructure that you are committed to defeat. But you gotta start with your own contradiction. You have benefited from white privilege. You have to be able to acknowledge that. You have to say you've been infected with the virus of white supremacy. I say the same thing to myself. I have to constantly fight against the virus of white supremacy and how it has tried to destroy my soul. I have to fight all the time. I have to pray. I have to sing. I have to shout. I have to think. I have to work. My whole being, every single day of my life, is a fight for liberation of my soul. And that's where you start. But there is no easy, simple answer. There's no McDonald's answer to this. We have to all be committed to liberation against all forms of oppression, exploitation, and human degradation. Find some supremacy that you are committed to defeat, and you've done the job.
I had the gift of being asked by a group of young adults to do a class on the eighth principle and what's going on with Unitarian Universalism right now. And I tried to reach back to what was going on in the 60s and when I came into ministry in the 90s, and to give them some sense of that. And there was such a passion from these young adults to find out more about what tradition they are coming into as young adults. And I'm scrambling to figure out what I entered into and how to pass that along. And so I guess I'm looking for resources, because I've read books, I've talked with folks, I'm educating myself, but I'm wondering if there's something afoot that I can use as a resource, an educational tool, a curriculum, that can help people who are just coming into Unitarian Universalism and want to know about this eighth principle, but also the history of where we step in it and what we can avoid if we pay attention.
there's not much because denial is not just a river in Africa. A lot of this is just gonna be catch as catch can. You kind of have to know one figure and you go down a rabbit hole with them, and then you end up finding out about others. If you could start with Mark Morrison Reed's Darkening the Doorways, you'll get a lot of people in that book. A lot of people that probably most UUs never hear of in their lifetime of being a UU. That's probably the best place to start. I mean, White Pioneers and the Black Denomination is good, but Darkening the Doorways is better in that aspect. And if you just want to do something outside, I always recommend Du Bois. Because everybody should read Du Bois.
The Radical King.
And Black Reconstruction is always a good place to start. If you want to know the month we're in, you have to know where it came from.
Yeah, I recommend.
Oh, yeah, that's the book she's talking about.
No,
Oh, no, it's not.
This is Mark's latest book, and sometimes we have a difference with a lot of things that are in here. But I do recommend that if you want to know something about the controversy during our era, this is a good compendium of some aspects of what happened. I don't think that you read this to understand what happened, but if you want to get some factual grounding in the ABCs, this is also a useful resource. I highly recommend it. This is it's the Black Power in Unitarian Universalism, revisiting the empowerment of controversy. It just came out last year, so it's a good resource for the ABCs. But mine that I'm writing, I think, will be even better to understand.
Ted.
I'm Ted Fetter, and yes, I like Mark's book very much. I can now hardly wait to understand more with another book. My question goes back to the Memphis congregation. I'm fascinated to learn what you shared with us. Can you tell us just a little bit more about the contemporary view of responsibility for missing the boat 50 years ago, for any sense of special responsibility now? I can certainly imagine a congregation that is okay with some action but not too much. But is there anything special about the Memphis congregation that you can share?
Oh, there's many special things about my congregation.
Hold it down.
Down here?
Yeah.
We're about here. There isn't a lot of awareness of it, of that era in the congregation that I've found. The people who were there at the time, there are, we'll talk about it if you ask. But there aren't a lot of people there who were there at the time. It's been 50 years, and it's been 50 years of a congregational culture that hasn't done. I'm picking my words very carefully. A congregational culture that hasn't been very involved in certain kinds of justice work. Their justice work has been done, but it hasn't been a thing the congregation was getting very involved in. And it's a conversation that I think now it's interesting how the floodgates have sort of opened. That people now have approached me and want to tell me stories about this and want to say, let me tell you what it was like for me 50 years ago. And we have people in the congregation who were involved. That's what makes it interesting is, the guy who printed, Mr. Fred printed all the I am a man signs and loaded them all into his VW Beetle and drove them down to Mason Temple. And he was a member at the same time that James Madison Barr was the so he and Dr. Barr, it was a lot. So like the stories that you hear are sort of just coming to the surface. And, I think our work right now is just acknowledging learning to acknowledge where we were, and doing more justice work all the time.
My question is about how collective white reparations are possibly involved in, or how, are they a part of the eighth principle? And are collective white reparations necessary for dismantling white supremacy?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm glad that you raised the issue of reparations, because part of what you need to understand, and I want to stand up for this one, is that inside of the Black Unitarian Universalist movement, part of what we said to the Unitarian Universalist Church is that the grant that we seek is a reparational grant. And when we launched the Back Bond program, which was a way to transfer capital from local congregation portfolios into cooperative economic development in African American communities, we sought to do that with a $5 million low-interest long-term debenture. We called it a reparational reinvestment. That was the year 1969. Part of why we were so intense about that General Assembly is we had just left the National Black Economic Development Conference, in which James Foreman made a statement to America that demanded $100 million in reparations for Black people. And he said that the churches should be the primary source to pay these reparations. And he went around the country and disrupted Sunday morning worship services, nailing a thesis to the door demanding reparations from the churches to Black people. Now, the issue of white reparations, as you have labeled it, I don't call it white reparations, and I don't think you should either. I think you should call it reparations and reparatory justice. And I say that because it's not an individual problem of a white person to be concerned with reparations. It's an institutional and a systems problem, and systems question, and that's how I think we should see it, because when you start saying white reparations, then individual white people start saying, well, I don't owe anybody any reparations, or that was not my ancestors, or I was not a part of that. This gentleman right here, Mr. Willard Lett, is a part of a group called in Cobra, who has been on the firing line and in the forefront of the reparations issue, and he is far more adept at the details of what's happening with reparations today and the conversation that is taking place. But what we do know is that the churches, the universities, the financial institutions, the banks, all of them were involved in income being received from the slave trade. And I went to universities in New England, also benefited from the slave trade. All you gotta do is the research. And I say that because all of America's primary institutions were involved in benefiting from the enslavement of people. And that's who is responsible, and that's who has to indeed be involved in reparatory justice. Individual white persons have to do something slightly different, I think, and that is go back to support of some liberation project and the defeat of some supremacist system inside of America. But do not fall into the trap of letting yourself believe that you are individually responsible or other white persons are responsible as individuals, because it's a systems problem. But it is one that should be lifted up, and it is one that we should all fight for. So I appreciate the question that you asked. And I'm available to come to churches and speak about a whole range of questions. I haven't abandoned Unitarian Universalism altogether. I just wanted to add that.
Okay. Bob stood up, so I'll stay up too. Reparations is really not complicated, but it's fascinating and complicated and all that. But even more than that, what white UUs could actually do is make their congregations more welcoming to everybody, not just people of color, but to everybody. Whether we're talking about ableism, whether you're talking about homophobia, transphobia, and classism, because classism is going to end up killing you, even before racism does, because the exodus happened once, it can happen again. And those people will find a place. But classism if not tackled now, will never get tackled in Unitarian Universalism. So if you actually made your congregations what you say they're supposed to be, if you actually followed the 7 principles when it came to congregational practice, then things might get a little bit better. And then we could actually start talking about reparative justice and reparations and what that means in the grand scheme of things when it comes to people of color in Unitarian Universalism.
So we are over time, and I want to thank you all for coming, and I want to thank our brilliant panel.